Toronto Star. I'm Rudgy Midler, and this matters. Every parent who has sent their kid to school or daycare knows that their child is a potential hot zone for catching COVID-19 and bringing it home. Schools have been shut down, but daycares remain open, and as such, they have been causing outbreaks amongst families throughout the province. A perfect anecdote for now is that there are plenty of pandemic toddlers who have been tested so many times they know the drill and have already come up with baby speak for COVID tests. That certainly does not make it more enjoyable for them or their parents. In a more perfect world, everyone knows that the only things kids should be sticking up their noses are fingers, Lego pieces, and crayons, not nasal test swabs. Thankfully, there is a new effort coming to make things a little bit easier for daycare families and testing. Jennifer Yang is a health reporter at The Star. She joins us to talk about daycares, family outbreaks, and testing. Jenny, I know you've been working incredibly hard covering COVID and you've been doing amazing work. I want to thank you so much for making the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
I know while a lot of people are really concerned about getting vaccinated right now, but I don't know, maybe this is just anecdotal as a parent, but I've heard of a ton of parents that have recently caught COVID-19 through daycare exposure. Do we have any idea how big a problem this is?
We have some idea. When COVID cases are confirmed in daycares, those cases get reported by public health units to the province. So we have numbers. And what we can see is that there are more cases linked to daycares than ever before in the province, especially in hotspots like Toronto and Peel. But, it's not a true picture. It really isn't, because we know, one, so many little kids especially get sick asymptomatically, so they might not get detected. But also, two, when a daycare outbreak occurs, close contacts will be referred for testing, but not every parent chooses to take their little kid for testing because they have to self-isolate for 2 weeks anyway. And those trips to the testing center are really difficult, sometimes traumatic for little kids and families. And a lot of parents just choose not to do it. So it's not a full picture. We just know that, yes, cases are higher than they've ever been before in the pandemic.
Jenny, it was traumatic for me. Now, here's the thing. Awful. And all of that, I didn't even have the tough one. I had the one that was less, and it was still awful. Anyways, schools are closed. Daycares have remained open, unless, of course, there's been an exposure. You wrote about this a few weeks ago, and this is what some experts were already saying. If you could, now was the time to pull your kids. What were these experts saying?
Yeah, I spoke with Dr. Janine McCready at Michael Garron Hospital, and she was just saying COVID is so rampant right now that if families can afford to do so, if they have the privilege to pull their kids from daycare, it was what she was actually recommending, which I found to be quite remarkable, because I think people in her position are really reluctant to make advice like that for parents. They don't want to scare people. They don't want people to make their own lives harder than they need to be. But that was her perspective. She was seeing a lot of cases linked to daycares where the virus was just tearing through the entire family and then spreading also throughout the daycares. She was saying that anecdotally, she was seeing more cases linked to daycares and also broader spread within daycares. It was a new thing that she hadn't been seeing in prior waves. She included the caveat that she doesn't have the full picture because, as I mentioned at the top of this interview, we don't know the true numbers of COVID rates in Toronto or in the province within daycares. And we don't know, the proportion of cases that are infected in daycares versus kids who get infected elsewhere or staff and showing up inside daycares. But she did make that recommendation because the risk is just so high right now. But, recognizing that so many families, so many parents, essential workers, especially who rely on daycare to do their jobs, is really just not an option for everybody, which just sucks. Parents are in a really awful, awful position having to choose between two terrible options.
I think we're going to get into this later, but I think every parent, daycares or school, this has been a Sophie's choice for this whole thing, where, that there's a potential exposure at your school, and basically it's been a luck of the draw type of thing, right? If you didn't get it, you got lucky. That's basically how I am looking at it personally. There's no other way to, right?
Absolutely. And, I think I tweeted about this, but it's hard to appreciate how hard it is to work at home with a 2-year-old also under your care, unless you've ever been in that position. I think a lot of non-parents can imagine it, but until you've lived it, it's really hard to appreciate how impossible and deadening and exhausting and demoralizing it is to juggle a full-time job and full-time childcare at home. So to voluntarily put yourself in that position because you're worried about COVID risk, it doesn't feel voluntary, first of all. You feel like you're forced to do it. But when you're doing it and you're making the choice to do it, it's awful. And your decision is never going to be validated because you'll never really know, like, did I overreact? Did I dodge a bullet? All you'll know is that you made your own life more miserable, and no one is ever going to tell you you made the right choice definitively. So it's such a hard decision to make. And then if you keep your child in daycare, every day you're taking them there with a pit in your stomach, or you're up at night worrying about it. You're putting your kid in an environment where they may get infected with COVID and bring it home to you and other members of your family, or spread it to other people in the daycare community or the staff who are still largely unvaccinated. So you're weighing so much as a parent in this position.
So Jenny, you've recently reported on a new daycare testing program. What does that entail?
So in the last couple of months, schools have closed, but daycares have remained open. And what's also happened is we've seen unprecedented community spread, and more daycare cases are popping up than ever in the pandemic. And I think what it's highlighted is that there's a real need for a more coordinated testing strategy for daycare families. Because as you and I, addressed off the top of this interview, testing is it can be really traumatic even for adults, let alone little kids. And a lot of families just really dread taking their kids for testing, even when it would be better for them to do so, not just to, keep their own family safe and have the information they need to, stay safe within their own household and social networks, but also it keeps the whole daycare community safe when people who are referred to testing by Toronto Public Health actually go and do it. But we actually know that a lot of parents just don't go for testing when there is a case in their daycare because they're already having to self-isolate at home for 14 days anyway. And it can feel really hard and traumatic for families to have to subject their little kid to a very invasive nasal swab. I've heard really sad stories from parents who've had to take their kids for testing 6, 7, 8, 9 times, and their kids are traumatized. One friend of mine, her little girl, will cover her nose and physically start trembling when they show up at the testing site. Another parent I interviewed for my story, one of her sons, who's 2, one of his first words, other than mama and dada and hi and bye, was COVID ouchie. He's been tested 6 times in his year of daycare. And it's a really upsetting, traumatic experience for him. So parents, if they can avoid having their kids be tested, it's perfectly rational and understandable that they would. But from the public health perspective, they want to encourage parents to test their kids because it's better and safer for them and their families, but also for the whole community. And so we can have an actual truer picture of how many outbreaks are happening and how big they're getting. So a couple of weeks ago, testing sites, hospitals, public health came together after seeing kind of a shift in these daycare related cases. And I think hearing a lot of feedback from daycares and families that testing is an awful experience. And it's also, there are disincentives for families to actually take their kids in. So this new program is just trying to make it more accessible, more child-friendly for families and daycares to really try and improve uptake rates of testing after Toronto Public Health recommends it. And Sick Kids is taking the bulk of daycare referrals now from public health. And what they're doing is just making it completely seamless and as child friendly as possible. Instead of having to scramble for a booking online, they're now designating days for daycare families to come to sick kids and get tested. Just show up anytime, no appointment necessary between certain hours. And you can even opt for a drive-through testing option. So you don't even have to leave the car. Your little baby can stay in the car seat. And they're offering more options for testing. So instead of the quote unquote brain tickler, which is really difficult to take, there's now a lower nose swab that also swabs the inside of the child's cheeks, and a spit test, which slightly older kids, 3 and older, can do. And so these options are, I know, kind of a game changer for a lot of families who previously might not have taken their kids in, but feel more comfortable doing so under these circumstances. And, the other key thing is sick kids, they're trained to work with kids. So, you take your kid, your little 2-year-old, to a testing site. The staff there are all wonderful, but they're not necessarily trained to work with kids. But at sick kids, they've got a lot of tricks up their sleeve. They've got the stickers, they've got the bubbles, they know how to talk to kids. They're telling them little stories about, the little stick coming up your nose, looking for gems, whatever. They're doing all the things that I think health practitioners who've trained their whole lives to work with kids are know how to do. And so that whole package is just hopefully making it easier for families to show up for testing and encouraging more families to go. And then the other thing they're doing is offering the option of mobile testing. So sick kids will send a testing clinic to the community. And this is really key for communities where there might be a lot of lower income people who can't afford to travel across the city because they don't have the time or the car. And so that's just making it easier too.
We'll be right back. I know the power of a sticker after a needle with my daughter, who's a little older now, so that magic works. That's a medical tool that is necessary. Now, Jenny, this is one of these things, you mentioned it before, we've talked a lot about teachers, but there really hasn't been a lot of talk about supporting daycare workers. I remember they were a godsend to me and my family. We're still friendly with them as we walk by the daycare. They're part of our community and our lives. What more do you think can be done?
Well, a few weeks ago, the big issue was that daycare workers had not been prioritized for vaccination along with teachers in hotspots and, special ed teachers or even bus drivers. And there was a lot of questions over why that was when daycare workers are still being asked to go to work and have remained open even as schools had closed. And the care they provide for kids is a lot closer. In schools, kids are masking, but daycare kids, they can't wear a mask. They don't know how to keep it on. They won't keep it on. And caring for a kid that up close means having them cough on you, barf on you, you're changing their diapers. They need to be picked up and held. So there was a lot of concern and outrage over the fact that daycare workers were not being prioritized for vaccination. They are now eligible for vaccination, so that's great. But I think what more can be done is just support them now to access vaccines and make bookings and go for appointments. They should be paid for the time off they need to go for vaccinations. They should be paid for any time off they need to deal with side effects from vaccines. Those are all really, I think, important measures that could be implemented now to better support daycare workers. And really, they should just be paid better and more overall because the work they do is so hard and is so risky in a pandemic. So I think all of those are really important measures that could still be taken.
Jenny, you talked about it a little earlier, you touched on it, and you did a long Twitter thread about this. This experience hits pretty close to home to you because it happened to you. I know how careful you have been throughout this pandemic, but can you talk a little bit about what happened with your family and just how you guys dealt with it?
Yeah, it was one of those occasions where I became affected by the thing that I've been reporting about, not just recently, but all year. I wrote a story, I think it was published April 13th, about the risks of COVID-19 in daycares. And this was the story where I quoted Dr. Janine McCready from Michael Garron Hospital recommending that parents who can afford to do so pull their kids from daycare. I wrote this story. It put the idea in my own head, should we pull our kid from daycare? wrestling with that difficult question, because if pulling her would mean undermining my ability to report on this pandemic. So, it was the story that I was working on that came out on April 13th. And as I was reporting that story, my kid was sent away from daycare because she showed a fever when we rolled up to the daycare to drop her off, and she had her temperature taken. So I was kind of, in the background of reporting the story, coordinating with my husband to figure out who was going to take her for testing and how we were going to, juggle our jobs that day and figure out the next day if her results didn't come back, really not expecting it to be anything other than another negative test because she just had some daycare virus that kids tend to get. But hours after the story that I wrote was posted online, we got her test results by email that she was positive. And I was completely shocked. And she did start getting sicker over the course of that day. And it was just completely disorienting and stressful. We suddenly had to kick into, infection prevention and control mode. Knowing everything I know through my year of reporting, I knew that the most important things to do were to mask ourselves, try and stay as distant from her as possible, which is really actually impossible when you have a 2-year-old. Obviously, we're still going to pick her up and comfort her and cuddle with her, but it just made the masking even more important. So what we wound up doing was we double masked in the house for the entirety of her infectious period, which was 10 days. So that was an N95 and a surgical mask on top that we wore for every waking hour over the course of 10 days. And we also, knowing the importance of ventilation, we kept all the windows open in the house to try and circulate the air as much as possible. And that was difficult too, because it was just really cold. It was also the week that it snowed recently, if you recall. So we were just freezing in our houses. We all slept in separate bedrooms, and we tried to have only one person with her for her meals so that when she was eating, which is kind of a high risk period in the day, there was only one parent in the room with her. And we just had to, plan for all these like worst case scenarios. And, my nightmare scenario was that both of us would become sick to the point where it would be really hard for us to get out of bed. I've read a lot of stories about people who have not needed hospitalization, but have been so sick that they're basically bedridden or, having to crawl to get to the bathroom because they're so out of breath. And imagining ourselves in that condition and having to chase after an active 2-year-old felt impossible to me. And we don't really have anyone around who we could ask to take care of her if we were to get sick to that extent. So we would have to manage somehow. And so, it was just trying to plan for that. And then every day, living in a paranoid state where you're scrutinizing every little itch in your throat, every little headache coming on. And there were a lot of headaches because it was so stressful and we were pretty sleep deprived. And so it was 10 days that we had to take these measures because that was her infectious period. And thankfully, both myself and my husband have stayed negative throughout. But that also means that we have to quarantine an additional 14 days in addition to the 10 days, because that's the length of time it could take for symptoms to emerge for us if we were infected on her last day. So I'm still in quarantine as we speak. It's actually my last day of quarantine. Tomorrow I'm coming out. So I'm really looking forward to that. I have never been more eager to just take a walk up and down my street.
I bet. I don't really, want to give this a lot of airtime because you wrote a Twitter thread about this, and like everything you read, it was beautifully written. But you told me afterward that the pearls came out. Like I said, I don't really want to talk about this too much because it makes me furious, and that anybody would attack any one of my colleagues, but particularly some before this. I just don't understand why. This is a challenge that every parent has had to face. Like, was this the anti-masker brigade or what?
It surprised me too. I wrote this thread because I thought that my experience might be instructive or helpful for families in Toronto or Ontario, our readers who are sort of in the same position as us with daycares. And my thread was really aimed at them. But what ended up happening was that it got picked up by somebody somewhere who does belong to a completely different demographic and has a completely different view of this pandemic and of COVID. And it started getting amplified in that circle. And, I would characterize it as kind of an anti-masker or anti-COVID, that circle of hell on Twitter. And it was just kind of surreal how quickly it was getting picked up in those circles. And I just started getting all sorts of tweets and even emails directed at me, accusing me of being mentally ill because of the precautions I described that we were taking in the house. I was being accused of being a paranoid hypochondriac. And then the tweets that really got under my skin were many that accused me of somehow mistreating our child or being abusive towards our child, because we were masking around her and trying to stay as socially distanced from her as possible. I think there was some who leapt to the conclusion that we were refusing to pick her up when she cried, which of course was not the case. I was just trying to describe in my thread that caring for a toddler necessitates close contact. So it's really hard to protect yourself from infection when they have been confirmed to have COVID. So it was just an onslaught of that. And, it was really upsetting to see and to experience, especially during such a stressful time in my own life, but is consistent with something that I and so many of my colleagues have experienced all pandemic, which is that as reporters are always getting a lot of negativity directed at us via Twitter or over email from readers who just don't agree with us. But it's at a kind of an unprecedented level with the pandemic. It's, for whatever reason, COVID is just an incredibly polarizing topic. And all the topics within COVID are polarizing in themselves too. So it was really upsetting to deal with. It comes with a job, but it shouldn't. And I hate that it does. But I'm still really glad that I tweeted the thread that I tweeted, because I also did hear back from so many parents, so many Torontonians, so many readers who said the Twitter thread really helped them, clarify their own decisions around whether or not to keep their kids in daycare, and that it helped to hear from someone like myself and my personal experiences with this. So, for the audience that thread was aimed at, I think it was helpful. And, that's really what I was hoping to do when I wrote that, stream of tweets, was I wanted to sort of offer my own experience as a piece of journalism or reporting that might help our readers figure out their own lives.
Well, I think I'm going to take this point to say, one, you are one of the best health reporters in this country. And it was recognized recently by the Canadian Association of Journalists, who have nominated you for Daily Excellence, which I think is a great award that you should be nominated for, because I do think you're excellent pretty much every day. Jenny, I want to thank you so much for your time, for sharing your story with us.
Thanks for having me on.
Jennifer Yang is a health reporter at the Toronto Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Rajin Buddher, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.